today's society, there are very few people who don't know what a drag queen is. If the words drag queen were to be said, I know that I would immediately think of all the eccentric men and women who just are wearing these over-the-top feminine makeup and outfits. So if you're listening to this speech, you know that for 6 or so minutes, I will be discussing the history behind drag queen culture, some current events about this culture, and what exactly we can learn from this culture from a communication standpoint. Overall, the purpose of this speech is to not only inform you about the current events, but also to allow you to feel a little more knowledgeable about the men and women who dress up as a peculiar and outlandish woman and why exactly they do it. So just a little bit of a historical background. To begin with, the history of drag queens, we must know that drag is a form of theatrical performance. According to Joe E. Jeffries, a drag historian at NYU, he claims that for this kind of theatrical performance, it entitles people, usually men, to perform in clothes that are considered to be not appropriate for them, obviously at that time. Joe E. Jeffries also claims that drag can be traced back to ancient Native American, indigenous South American, Egyptian ceremonies, and Japanese theater. So there are a lot of cultures kind of going into one. The term drag was first used in Britain. It was first used to refer to long skirts that men wore on stage. Fun fact, actually, men continued to wear exaggerated makeup and clothing to play female roles until it finally became legal for women to perform in 1660, and I have my own thoughts about that, but we will move on. Soon after, men started impersonating females and performing in vaudeville shows, I think is what it's called. I'm obviously not super familiar with theatrical terms, so don't come for me. Those are actually a type of entertainment featuring specialty acts like burlesque comedies, songs, and dances. William Dorsey Swan was actually the first person to call himself a queen of drag, and he began to host drag balls in the 1880s. Some may see men who participate in drag to be gay or questioning their sexuality, but drag was never associated with homosexuality until sexology, those professors who kind of study that kind of stuff, developed ideas about a third sex in an attempt to rationalize why drag queens really even existed, why that wanting was really there. For a while after, those who cross-dressed were shunned, and they eventually had to go to underground gay bars and practice drag there, and then that began to kind of emerge and be a popular thing. According to Seth Palmer, he's an author of an anthropological analysis of drag queens in American culture. It wasn't until Hollywood movies like the Rocky Horror Picture Show and musician David Bowie started to experiment with cross-dressing, and that's when it finally began to be accepted in American society again. It's just funny because the people that we used to oppress now, because famous people did it, it's like, yes, we accept you now. It's just silly. So, as mentioned earlier, drag queens are pretty prevalent in our society. Very few people do not know what a drag queen is. A current event that I actually found recently regarding drag queens was written by Isabel Lewis. She's a writer for The Guardian. And for decades, the only people who performed drag were men. This was because, as mentioned earlier, it's kind of associated with gay men and gay culture ever since the 1800s. That's when it really began to be questioned. According to Lewis from The Guardian, she talks about how women were actually fighting the patriarchy and becoming cisgender drag queens. Cisgender means that you identify with the same gender that you're assigned at birth, right? And that's who you're attracted to as well. It's the opposite sex. One female drag queen in specific, she's 27 years old, her name is Victoria Scone. She says that critics who question my right to be on a drag show are misogynists. So the culture around drag is changing. For as long as drag has existed, it's been performed by men. But why, right? As the world continues to spin and opinions change, culture is going to shift and start becoming more inclusive. I'm personally excited to see this shift, and I look forward to seeing a lot more progress in this community, honestly. Although a lot of progress has happened, we always look forward to more and being more inclusive to different types of people. So how does this whole crazy culture have anything to do with communications? I think that we can begin with the fact that this is intercultural communication at its finest. To begin with, there are so many different cultures that play into drag. As mentioned previously, drag was traced back to Native Americans, Indigenous South Americans, Egyptian ceremonies, and Japanese theater. In addition, N. Simmons, a professor at UCLA, claims that drag culture utilizes forms of communication through performances, social media, and television, broadcasting, and so much many more. Maintaining social relationships within the LGBTQ+ community allows drag performers to have an additional culture that they belong to. And due to this close connection between the LGBTQ+ community and the drag community, losing this relationship would honestly be detrimental for drag performers. And as mentioned earlier, doing drag isn't always performed by homosexual people. It also allows for people that are part of the LGBTQ+ community to be able to communicate who identify differently and obviously are parts of different walks of life, right? From this, we can learn that there's a greater impact when you see people dressing up in overly feminine costumes. It allows people to belong to a special type of culture, a culture full of color and just full of belonging. So overall, just in conclusion, learning about drag was so interesting. I hate to admit it, but I honestly always stayed away from drag just because I felt like I couldn't identify with it and I didn't really understand the culture behind it. So now that I do, I learned that it's definitely an inclusive culture. They allow everyone and anyone to come in and just celebrate and just be entertained and have fun, right? And so from this culture, we can learn a lot from their history, from the current events going on day to day, and learning from the way they communicate interculturally. We just have to pay attention. So thank you so much.